They told him the war was over, but he didn't feel it end on a battlefield. He felt it end in the sound of an airplane door sealing shut, in a hard bench seat, in the stale smell of paper and canvas. And in one sentence, he wrote with a steady hand, even though his heart wasn't steady at all. I'm 2 days from home. For most Americans, victory is a headline. For the men who carried it, victory was a long chain of ordinary moments, stitched together by discipline, endurance, and the stubborn decision to keep going until you could step onto your own porch again. And for one American soldier, the most important proof he ever left behind wasn't a medal or a photograph. It was a letter that never made it into the mail, a letter written on the edge of home, folded so many times the crease became permanent, then hidden away until the day his family finally opened it and realized the war had followed him back, not in violence, but in silence, in routine, and in the way he kept a porch light burning as if it were a promise. This is Stories of Honor, letters, memories, legacy. And this is 2 days from home, the letter found decades later from a stop the world forgot, but a soldier never did. His name was Robert Bobby Hale, and if you'd met him after the war, you would have seen what everyone saw. A quiet man with a steady handshake, the kind of neighbor who waved, fixed things without talking much, and never asked for attention. He didn't tell war stories. He didn't lean into the spotlight. He lived the way a lot of men from that era lived, proud of what he did, grateful he made it back, and determined to build a life so ordinary and decent that it felt like the true victory. But before he became that man, before he became the father and the grandfather and the guy who always checked the porch light at night, he was just Bobby, a young American who grew up with the sound of a radio in the kitchen and the comfort of a home that ran on small rituals: coffee in the morning, work during the day, supper at the table, a light left on at dusk, and one person who anchored all of it for him: his wife, Evelyn. Evelyn didn't love big speeches. She loved reliability. She loved the kind of love you could count on, the kind that showed up on time and did the right thing without needing applause. She wrote grocery lists in careful handwriting. She kept the house clean even when she was tired. She had a way of making the home feel warm, even when the world outside felt unstable. When Bobby left to serve, she didn't pretend it was easy. She held herself together because that's what Americans did in those years. She kissed him goodbye and told him 2 things: write when you can, and come back when you can. And Bobby told her one thing, said it like a vow instead of a sentence: I'll come home to you. People like to imagine that the end of war is a clean line. The truth is, for the men who served, the end was a long, uncertain corridor. It was paperwork and waiting, and travel and more waiting. It was excitement and exhaustion mixed together until you couldn't separate them anymore. It was the strange feeling of being close to home, and still not being home, like you were walking toward your life, but couldn't quite step back into it. When Bobby's unit was finally cleared to return, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: the future. Not the abstract idea of it, but the real thing. The smell of his own house, the creak of his porch steps, the sound of Evelyn's voice in the kitchen, the possibility of waking up and not having to be anywhere except his own life. He wrote his last over there letter the way he wrote most of them: careful, not dramatic, a steady voice meant to protect the people reading it. He told Evelyn he was all right. He told her he was proud of her. He told her to keep the radio on while she cooked, so the house wouldn't feel too quiet. He told her he thought about the porch light, the way a man thinks about a landmark in the distance, not because it was a bulb, but because it was a signal. It meant home was waiting. It meant she was still doing her part. It meant the life he was coming back to still existed. And then the travel started. Europe behind him, home ahead, and in between. A route that seemed impossible until he actually lived it. He boarded a transport plane with a small bag and a body that felt older than its age. There were men around him who talked too loud, laughed too hard, or went quiet the moment they sat down. Some stared at nothing. Some held photographs. Some clutched letters like they were proof they were still real. This part of the war didn't have gunfire or smoke. It had something else, the weight of anticipation. It had the fear of hoping too much. It had the strange superstition that if you celebrated early, the universe would snatch it away. The plane lifted, the engines steadied, and Bobby realized something that sounds simple until you felt it. He was moving toward home, but he didn't know who he would be when he got there. Hours later, after a long flight that felt longer because of how badly everyone wanted it to end, they landed for a stop that most of them didn't know much about. They were told it was a key link in the route home, a place that handled an unbelievable number of returning men, a place that could move hundreds of soldiers a day through a narrow window of time. It wasn't New York. It wasn't Virginia. It wasn't even the Caribbean the way people back home imagined it. It was a city in Brazil, Natal, and the name of the airfield sounded like something out of a briefing that had been repeated so many times it lost its meaning. Parnamirim Field. Bobby stepped down into warm air that didn't feel like home, but didn't feel like war either. It felt like a threshold. The sun was sharp and honest. The sky looked too wide. The ground crews moved with that brisk competence that makes a soldier relax a fraction because it tells him somebody here knows what they're doing. He noticed small things immediately, because that's what men do when they're trying to stay steady. The sound of boots on hard ground, the smell of fuel, the way the wind pushed at clothing, the distant hum of activity as planes came and went. He'd heard people say that this field was one of the busiest in the world at the peak of the war, and now, seeing the flow of men and equipment and movement, he believed it. It wasn't chaos, it was order, a disciplined machine built for one mission: keep the line moving, keep the men fed, keep the route home open. They were processed like travelers and like troops at the same time. There were rules, lines, instructions, and a strange insistence on neatness. Shirts buttoned, pants worn correctly, a certain posture. It wasn't about appearances. It was about control. When everything in your life has been uncertain, order becomes comfort. Bobby noticed the barracks were clean, the bunks packed tight together, the atmosphere both tired and hopeful. Men lay down and stared at the ceiling. Men wrote. Men slept like they hadn't slept in years. And hovering over all of it was the same shared thought that nobody wanted to say out loud. We're close. We're so close. In that stopover, Bobby did what he had done through the war. He went looking for the mail, not because he expected anything new to arrive there, but because writing was his way of keeping the thread unbroken. He had been taught, like so many Americans, that you don't let the people at home drift into the dark. You write, you reassure, you keep the bond alive. He sat on a bunk with a piece of paper and a pen that felt too small for what he needed to say. He started the letter the way he always did, with Evelyn's name, as if writing it could summon her into the room. Evelyn, he wrote, and the handwriting stayed neat because he needed it to. Neat handwriting was a kind of self-control. Neat handwriting meant his hands weren't shaking. Neat handwriting meant the war didn't get to decide what he looked like on paper. He told her where he was, not in a way that would worry her, but in a way that would make her smile at the idea of him being somewhere so far and still heading home. He told her the air was warm. He told her the field was busy. He told her he'd never seen so many planes in one place. He told her the men were tired but different now, lighter around the edges, as if the burden had shifted. And then he wrote the line that became the title of this story, the line his granddaughter would read decades later and feel her throat tighten, "I'm 2 days from home." He didn't underline it. He didn't dress it up. He didn't make it a speech. He just wrote it like a fact, as if saying it plainly would make it true. Then he paused, and the pause is where you can feel the humanity in the letter, because there are things men want to say when they are that close to the finish line. He wanted to say he missed her hands. He wanted to say he missed the quiet. He wanted to say he'd forgotten what it felt like to wake up without listening to the world. He wanted to say he was excited and afraid at the same time. Because hope can be frightening when you've lived so long without it. He wanted to say that coming home wasn't just travel, it was transformation. Instead, he wrote about the porch light. "Keep it on," he wrote, "just like you always do, not because I won't find the house, because I want to see it." That's what Americans need to hear in stories like this. Not the violence, not the spectacle, the purpose, the reason service matters. It matters because of that light, because of the house behind it, because of the family inside it, because millions of ordinary American routines were protected by men who accepted discomfort so others could live in peace. Bobby didn't talk about war in that moment. He talked about home the way a man talks about the thing that saved him. The next day, the route continued, but there was one more detail that made this stop feel different to Bobby, something he mentioned briefly in the letter without turning it into drama. Before boarding again, the aircraft was treated, sprayed as a precaution against insects and disease. It was a small, practical procedure, and yet it struck him as symbolic. Even near the end, even on the way home, there were protocols, safeguards, steps that reminded him how many moving parts it took to bring a man back safely. He was leaving war behind, but he was still under the discipline of a system designed to protect him and the people waiting for him. It felt like the war's final lesson. Freedom isn't careless. Freedom is maintained. He folded the letter and put it in his pocket with the others. That should have been the end of it. The letter should have traveled from that busy airfield, across the route, into the American mail system, and into Evelyn's hands. She should have opened it at the kitchen table, read the line, 2 days from home, and cried with relief. She should have looked out at the porch light that evening and whispered his name into the quiet. She should have waited those 2 days with a heart so full it hurt. That's what should have happened. But it didn't. That letter never got mailed. There was no stamp, no postmark, no proof it ever moved beyond Bobby's pocket. And that single fact is what turns this into a story worthy of 30 minutes and more. Because now you have a mystery that isn't sensational, just human. Why would a man write 2 days from home and then not send it? Why would a man carry hope in his hands and then keep it hidden? The answer is not a conspiracy. The answer is what older Americans understand instinctively. Sometimes men don't send the most important things because they want to deliver them in person. Sometimes a letter stays unsent because it is too sacred to hand to the mail. Bobby reached the United States on a chain of flights and waiting rooms and commands shouted over engines. He passed through checkpoints, stood in lines, carried his bag, watched men reunite, watched men stand alone, watched the world slowly turn from wartime urgency into something resembling normal life. He was tired in a way that sleep couldn't fix. He was eager in a way that frightened him. He was close enough to taste home, and still far enough to feel like something could go wrong. When he finally stepped onto American ground with the knowledge that the next part would be by train and bus and familiar roads, he felt his chest tighten, not with fear, with the sudden weight of everything he had survived, with the realization that he was returning to a life that had been moving without him, with the question he hadn't allowed himself to ask until now: will I fit back into my own home? He did come home. He walked up the steps. He saw the porch light glowing exactly the way he imagined it. He heard the radio inside. He smelled coffee and soap and something that felt like safety. And when Evelyn opened the door, the moment wasn't loud. It wasn't a movie scene. It was real. Her face changed first. Shock, relief, disbelief. Then her hands came up as if she needed to touch him to confirm he wasn't a dream. Bobby didn't say much, not because he didn't feel much, because he felt too much. He stood there in the doorway under that light and understood the truth that would shape his life. Homecoming is not a finish line. It's a beginning. In the weeks after, Evelyn learned something about Bobby that she couldn't have learned from any letter. He was present, but quieter, loving, but careful. He didn't want to burden her with the weight he carried, and because of that, he sometimes carried it alone. When Bobby died, the family went through the house the way families do, quietly, with that strange mix of grief and gratitude. They opened drawers that hadn't been opened in years. They found old receipts, photographs, handkerchiefs, small objects that felt suddenly sacred because they were his. They found a box in the attic wrapped in a faded quilt. The tape was yellowed. The lid was soft at the corners. And on top, in Evelyn's handwriting, were simple words that made everyone stop. Keep these safe. Inside were letters stacked and folded and tied with ribbon. Some had been opened long ago. Some looked untouched. Some smelled faintly like old paper and time. And there, among them, was an envelope with no stamp, no postmark, and a date written in the corner, Evelyn's name on the front, and a location in small letters that the granddaughter had to read twice to understand: Natal, Brazil. She opened it carefully, as if the paper could feel disrespect. She unfolded the letter slowly, the way you unfold something that might change the way you understand a whole person. The handwriting was neat. The tone was steady. The content was simple and devastating in its tenderness. Evelyn, it began, and then, halfway down, the sentence that made the room go silent: I'm 2 days from home. The granddaughter read it out loud, and in that moment, the family realized something that Americans carry deep in their bones. The war didn't only happen over there. It happened in kitchens. It happened in mailboxes. It happened in the waiting. It happened in the discipline of people who kept their homes warm and their lights on while men traveled across the world to return. But the true emotional punch wasn't just the line. It was what came after. Bobby wrote about wanting to see the porch light, about needing that sight like a man needs air. He wrote about how the order of the stop, the clean bunks, the lines, the rules, all of it made him feel like he was walking through a doorway back into normal life. He wrote about men around him who were excited and afraid at the same time. He wrote about how close home felt, and yet how strange it was to believe in home again. And then he ended the letter with something he never said out loud, something he never needed to say, because he lived it. If you ever wonder why I'm quiet when I get back, it's because I'm listening for normal again. Don't worry, keep the light on, I'm coming. The granddaughter looked up from the page and saw her grandmother's kitchen as if for the first time. The radio on the counter, the kettle, the table, the window, the porch beyond it. She understood that Evelyn had been doing exactly what Bobby asked, without ever reading the letter. She had kept the light on anyway. She had built the home anyway. She had carried her part of the war without a uniform, without praise, without recognition. That is patriotism too. The American story is not only soldiers, it is also the people who held the country together while those soldiers were gone. And when the family read that letter, they weren't just reading Bobby's words, they were reading Evelyn's life in reverse. That night, after everyone left and the house got quiet, the granddaughter walked out to the porch alone. She stood under the light and looked down the street. It was peaceful, ordinary, the kind of peace people forget is precious until they learn what it cost. She reached up, checked the bulb the way Bobby always did, and smiled through tears because she finally understood why he was like that. It wasn't superstition. It wasn't fussiness. It was ritual. It was gratitude. It was the simplest way a man could say every single evening, "I made it home." This is what your channel is built for. Not spectacle, but meaning. Not violence, but honor. Not shock, but legacy. A letter from a busy airfield far from America, written 2 days from home, never mailed, and yet arriving exactly when a family was ready to understand the quiet patriotism that lived in their own kitchen all along. This is stories of honor, letters, memories, legacy. If you have a family letter, a photograph, or a memory tied to service, share it in the comments, because sometimes the most important stories don't come with a headline. Sometimes they come folded in an envelope, carried home in a pocket, and finally opened under the same porch light that never stopped shining.